This could have been a great day. The one day in the year we get to wear red. A baptism of little Lauren. It doesn't get better than that. And that would have made two great Sundays in a row. Confirmation and baptisms last week, and then a baptism today on Pentecost. Two celebrations of the work of God's Spirit in our lives and in the life of the church. It could have been a great day. And then this language in Paul's letter, this passage in Romans, that makes it even better. This is language, trust me, that a preacher can get worked up about. The promise in God's Spirit, we are adopted children of God. The promise in God's Spirit, we are heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. So your parents got angry with you and wrote you out of their will. We, baptized children of God, we are heirs with Jesus. A great day and a great passage. We could have had a great time. Except one little two-letter word that Paul just couldn't leave out. One two-letter word followed by a little phrase taken together might make some parents decide not to bring their babies forward and let Ginger dump water on their heads. One little two-letter word. If. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirits that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, long dash, pause, if in fact we suffer with him, so that we may be glorified with him. Oh, Paul, if in fact we suffer with him? To those confirmands and youth being baptized last week, and to this little baby, we're saying, hey, yeah, you're sons and daughters of God. Come join the party, children of God, heirs with Christ, if you inherit his suffering as well. Any parents of infants want to change your mind about presenting your kids for baptism? Any youth or confirmands from last week wondering if there's a way we can undo what we did last week? If, in fact, we suffer with him. Darn that if. And I'm afraid the if stands. I don't think we can get rid of it. I think suffering is still the lot of Christians. So we might as well explore the if and see what suffering with Christ can look like. Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me." And of course, the cross is the central image of what it means for Christians to suffer. Now we say, that's my cross to bear, right? But at least in the Gospels, the cross is not an image of suffering in general. But the cross is the picture of a very specific, a very particular kind of suffering. It means suffering as a result of obedience to the way of Jesus. Suffering as a result of obedience to the way of Jesus. That's not the kind of suffering we get to do very much is it? This is turn the other cheek kind of suffering. And it's easy to avoid. We avoid it whenever we look at our world. Whenever we look at our world with its violence and its war, its divisions and its discriminations, its poverty and its own suffering, and we say, well, that's just the way the world is. It's got to be that way, and we accept it. And we even participate in it. When we say, well, you can't flee the world. You can't just be the Amish, right? You can't stop living, right? You gotta defend your values, right? And we easily avoid the if. We avoid the if by avoiding obedience to the way of Jesus. Adoption, children of God, joint heirs. If. I haven't seen the new movie 42 about Jackie Robinson and the integration of Major League Baseball. But I read an article about the movie that says that the movie left out a key aspect of the story, its thoroughly Christian dimension. The Dodgers manager, Branch Rickey, in his first conversation with Robinson, told Robinson that the first African-American man to play in Major League Baseball would undoubtedly be ferociously attacked, viciously fought. And the manager said he was looking for a man, quote, with the guts not to fight back. And Robinson agreed. And this is where the article says the movie leaves out some key parts of the story. The movie leaves out the fact, apparently, that the manager of the Dodgers was, quote, a Bible-thumping Methodist. Are there any of those still? And he believed that the integration of Major League Baseball was a moral necessity to influence the moral trajectory of our nation. It had to be done. And Jackie Robinson was apparently a committed Christian who had internalized Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And so in the first 2 years of this struggle, he spent many nights, whole nights in prayer on his knees, asking God to give him the courage and the strength to stay in the battle without himself resorting to violence or retaliation. He stepped into this moment in history willingly, and he suffered there willingly. He entered his if. Now, I don't know if that's the kind of suffering Paul here is talking about in Romans chapter 8. It's the kind of suffering we see all through the book of Acts. And if it's the same spirit of Pentecost that is inspiring the church today, then I wonder if the Spirit might be asking us, what is your if? Where do you, church, need to be? What step do you need to take? What battle do you need to enter that will keep you on your knees throughout the night, begging God for the courage and the strength to stay obedient witnesses to the way of Jesus? What, church, is your if? Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me. But we still use the language of having a cross to bear to refer to all different kinds of suffering, don't we? And it's not usually, let's be honest, we're suffering for our convictions as Christians. Usually it's just suffering, right? It's illness, it's disease, it's loss, it's grief. It's suffering no one caused, it's suffering no one chose, it's suffering we can't avoid, it's random and it's meaningless. Is that suffering? Suffering with Christ? Well, it can be if we let it. A few weeks ago, I mentioned in a sermon a new book by Richard Lisher called Stations of the Heart, Parting with a Son. It's his memoir of the last 3 months of his 33-year-old son Adam's life before he died of cancer. Now, usually I don't mention the same book twice in a 6-week period, but there aren't many books so worth reading, so moving and challenging and even inspiring. Lisher, in many ways, is an observer, a spectator, learning from his son in these months how to die. And when Adam discovered that he was dying, he threw himself wholeheartedly into his relatively new Catholic faith. He and his pregnant wife started praying the Psalms and the liturgy every morning and every evening. They went to Mass every day just down the road at Immaculate Conception Catholic Church. Adam, in these months, plumbed the depths of Christ's suffering to see if he could find his own suffering there. And after his diagnosis, he began to collect crosses. He'd always valued the cross. He was raised by Lutherans, after all. But Lisher writes that in this period, he embraced the cross as his bond with Jesus. Lisher writes, it was cancer and the cross, death and the cross, a lost family and the cross. He had now become part of that groaning immensity, Lisher writes, to which Jesus on the cross opened his arms. After Adam's death, every once in a while, a member of Immaculate Conception would see Lisher someplace and say to him something like, I can still see him sitting there in the pew with his head bowed praying. I can still see him there kneeling before the sacrament. And one time a woman stopped him and began to say something like this, I can still see him there. And Lisher interrupted, I wish you had known him as I knew him before he had become a victim. And she replied instantly, no one saw him as a victim. He was, she said, a witness. A witness. He wasn't suffering for his convictions as a Christian, but he had found his suffering somehow joined to the suffering of Christ. And so his meaningless suffering in God's grace was able to gesture, to witness to the one whose suffering can make sense out of life and death. If, in fact, we suffer with him. But I think Paul here in Romans is speaking of another kind of suffering. The verb here, to suffer with, it's a verb that comes from the same root as the word for suffering in the very next verse, which we didn't read. I am convinced, Paul says, that the suffering of this present time is not worth being compared with the glory about to be revealed. And that word for suffering is identical to the word Paul uses in chapter 7, the very preceding chapter, but we wouldn't recognize that. Because there it's usually translated as passions. He's referring in chapter 7 to sinful passions. Passions are things we suffer. It feels like they come from outside of us, right? We suffer them. And I think that Paul here, when he says that we are suffering with Christ, is talking about our suffering the wounds of temptation and sin that Christ himself suffered to heal, and that one day will be healed. It's what Paul later in Romans 8 calls groaning for the redemption of our bodies. I call it living in the ache. Living in the ache. And here's the twist. In some odd way, it's a good thing. This ache is like the ache of the young artist who sees how far his art is from the beauty of the master's art. And there's a suffering for him in recognizing that distance. But it's a suffering that drives him closer to the master so that he can get better. And the distance can close, living in the ache. The folks I've learned the most from about living in this ache, living with the ongoing wounds of sin and temptation, are those early Christian monks and hermits I've mentioned before called the desert fathers and mothers. We think, oh, desert monks, they must already be saintly, already be perfect, but they knew intimately the ongoing suffering of temptation and sin. In fact, that's one of the reasons these monks and hermits left the distractions of society and went to the desert so they could give all of their time and energy and attention to living with these wounds and offering them to God for healing every single day. Here's one of the sayings of these early desert monks. When Cyrus of Alexandria was asked about the temptation of lust, he said, "If you are not tempted, you have no hope. If you are not tempted, it is because you are sinning. The one who does not fight at the stage of temptation is sinning already in the body. The one who is sinning in his flesh has no trouble from temptation." In other words, if you're not suffering, if you're not troubled, if you're not in this struggle, it's because you've already given in. But if, as Paul says, you're led by the Spirit, then expect to be in this struggle. Expect to be keenly aware of this kind of suffering. And Paul and these monks, they don't just write about lust. They write about all kinds of passions. They write about greed. They write about gossip. They write about judging others and comparing ourselves to others. All kinds of wounds and temptations that we still suffer. Expect, they say, to be in this struggle. Expect to suffer from these wounds. Just know this. They are wounds on their way toward healing. Just know this. When you are in this struggle, you are there with Jesus, who has already won. In that case, friends, baptized, adopted children of God, heirs with Christ. In that case, this is a great day after all. For if we suffer, it's at least suffering with Christ. If we're in this struggle, we're in the struggle with one on our side who has already won it for us. So give thanks and do not lose heart. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.